Excellent.
Yes,
All
we're
good to
good to
go, John?
go. Wonderful. We're live. Fantastic. Alrighty. Gonna click that on. Right. So welcome back all again. You probably know who I am, but just for clarity's sake, my name is John Jacobs, the director and one of the co-founders of the Atlantic Forum, together with my dear friend and colleague Igor Murheim, who unfortunately is not able to join us today due to family business. Nothing too severe, I understood. But nevertheless, priorities are always with the home front. But nevertheless, we still have two very great people with us, Hannah Christensen and Mark Tilley. Um, we'll get a bit to why we got them there. Because the title, that's first what I want to touch into. Yes, sorry, Hannah. I know that. So side thing completely. Now we're going completely off topic. You don't know yet, but we agree with Hannah that this is going to be our very first podcast. So we're going to do this more often. She doesn't know yet, but it'll be fine. Anyway, so what is this podcast? What's this session all about? Um, for those that joined us half a year ago, we had a similar session like this at the very end. And I imagine, but sadly with COVID, it's not there yet, but I imagine they were actually standing on stage with having like a bar table and just a couple of young people hang around at a bar table trying to discuss all matters of world politics. I actually think that's a great concept for a podcast. Um, And what we're going to talk about today is this question about, right, so what are we going to do about it? So the previous panel in the keynote pretty much portrayed that, well, we're not all going to do down to it. It's not all bad stuff going out there, but there's definitely things that we have to fix. So the question can be then twofold. What are we generally as the transatlantic community going to do about it? But more importantly, so what are we here at this imaginary pub table in this imaginary conference room, us young professionals gathered here under the banner of Atlantic Forum, what are we going to do about it? With that, we have two wonderful guests. Hannah, first floor to you. Hannah, please introduce yourself to our podcast listeners.
um, Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Christensen. It's very nice to meet you all. And yes, like you said, this is our virtual pub table that I'm happy to have you join us at. Of course, for me, it's still a coffee table this early in the morning. But to introduce myself, I am the program coordinator for the NATO Field School. That's a program that's run out of Simon Fraser University here in Canada. And so that ended up involved with the Atlantic Forum because we have this common goal of increased youth engagement in transatlantic issues. And so that's something that I'm very excited to be talking more about today. And I'm very pleased that we get to be on the optimistic panel of looking forward and finding new solutions and how we're going to save the world. So thanks so much for having me.
Well, wonderful. And then we also have our British, Maltese, Algerian. I actually have no clue what you are, Mark. Mark, please enlighten us. Who are you?
I'm a very complicated international mess, and I'm very happy to be able to unpack that on my first virtual podcast. Well, I suppose all podcasts are virtual. A pub table from the comfort of my own home. I couldn't ask for more. So I'm Mark. I currently work for the International Organization for Migration, which is a UN body that's very program centric. So we have within our mandate, we work on anything relating to people on the move, and we also have a security component to our mandate. So that includes the return of or reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters, demobilization, disarmament, even de-radicalization. And this is the kind of thematic area that I work on. And it's very important to state at this moment as well that I am not representing this organization in anything I say. My boss will be very relieved to hear that disclaimer. Nice note. My background is in humanitarianism. It's in human security and human rights. And so you can think of me as coming into like the security arena kind of horizontally, because what we have in common with the kind of the security sector is that we work in the same context and are largely trying to achieve the same, i.e. peace. Not everyone may share that view, but I can be an optimist at times, and that's that's how I picture it.
Wonderful, wonderful, very positive remarks. And Hannah already kind of touched upon it with the Native Field School. Mark, with you as well. Both of you also have a decent history of various young professional groups, engagements, showing the world that young professionals can actually contribute quite well to the high level. And we've also seen that past month when both of you joined us in, no, Hannah, I'm not going to say it. It was Vicenza in Italy. Internal joke. At one point, it was referred to Florence, and one of our esteemed participants was convinced that they were in a different Italian city. See, that's really what COVID does to you, this whole lack of travel, this lack of knowing where we are exactly at one given point. Anyway, so we gathered in Vicenza at the Center of Excellence Directors Conference, where we had a small delegation of our young professionals joining in order to properly contribute, I'd say, to thinking of ACT. And that nicely loops back into what a large part of this conference this weekend is all about, is indeed the sort of the brain power, the thinking part of NATO, which is based in Norfolk, Virginia. But going back a bit more to the history of the stuff you've done in the past, Mark, you've been involved with election monitoring, you've been involved with YPFP. Well, you're now involved with us, so I think that's absolutely fantastic. But where would you say are really the things that you say, right, this was a very special, great moment, and we should totally be doing more about it because this is how we're going to fix things?
So, well, that's a big question. So, how to fix things and where to start. I'm going to very overtly evade your question, and I'm going to touch on something that you kind of started with regard to my background, because one, youth inclusion in the security agenda is really, really important to me. I think it's more than important. I think it's essential. I think it's essential to the security agenda functioning and understanding the societies within which it is asked to provide an effect. And so everything that I've done in some way relates to that. So you talked about election monitoring. To me, that kind of reflects the democratic aspect of youth participation in the security agenda. We all benefit from peace and from security. We are all stakeholders to peace and security, and we are all agents to peace and security, in as much as we don't only benefit from it, but we have a responsibility to enable it. And young people, as part of that society, I think, are often overlooked. And so there's a real kind of like democratic component to my motivation. And then I don't remember what the second thing was that you mentioned. Oh, YPFP. So yeah, so that's the young professionals in foreign policy is a brilliant kind of like incubator for ideas and for engagement, and I think it's very much built on the idea that young people today are the future leaders, and so if we can find ways to kind of like develop skills, competencies, and kind of exchange knowledge and experience, then we are essentially kind of planting the acorns of success. If there's an oak tree acorn metaphor that I think Winston Churchill made that I was trying to recall, and then I was too ambitious. I forgot it halfway through. But when it comes to fixing things, big picture, I think it's really mainstreaming of actors who make a very important part of our society and who have not traditionally been part of the security kind of discourse. And for me, these two things are kind of gender and youth, young people. We are the biggest demographic in society who historically have not been able to have a voice. In as much as under the age of 18, you have no way to participate in the democratic process. You can't vote. And if you can't vote, there is no incentive for decision makers to appeal to you. There's no incentive for them to reach out to you. And so for a very, very long time kind of worked in youth participation and youth engagement, because I think that's a real it's a scandal. I'm now going to defer to Hannah and her infinitely more coherent wisdom. Maybe I can offer.
Well, Hannah, anything to add to that based on what you've been doing with the NATO Field School, but also with the hackathon, or you had a team from Simon Fraser University joining? So
Yeah,
how was that? Do you feel you've been properly being able to contribute to the discussions that NATO was trying to have there?
I definitely think that there's sort of two sides to the importance of youth engagement. One would be for youth. I mean, all of us here in the Atlantic Forum and in YPFE, everything else, we want to get involved in these careers in security and defense and international relations, and it can be really hard to try and figure out what the right way in is, what the path is to get to a career like that. So there is a side of it that I think youth engagement is important for youth, for us in the future to get involved in this field. To have our voices heard now is also really important, to feel like we belong in this conversation. It can be a really tough nut to crack, it feels like, at times like this. And so having events like the NATO Policy Hackathon that I was part of earlier this year can be really important to make sure that youth feel like we are actually part of this conversation. That was a great event in that we had our Secretary General joining us. So I think that was a really important step in showing he is here, he's listening to the ideas that you want to put forward. And that definitely really matters in getting youth involved at this stage in our career. The other side of it, in something like the NATO Field School, is it's important to have youth engagement for the future of the alliance. These are the future policy leaders, especially for us on the civilian side, and making sure that youth feel like an organization like NATO, for example, is really important to our future security and defense. Getting this in now and making sure they feel like that as they go up through their career is going to be important for NATO in the future. As Mark said, a lot of the conversation now is trying to involve people in this discussion that have been previously ignored. So based on gender, I think for us, it's along racial lines as well. And for youth, getting more diverse voices into this conversation is going to be important so that in the future, we also feel like NATO matters. Because if the youth don't feel like NATO matters, then at a certain point, we're going to be the policymakers, and that's really going to affect an organization like this. NATO depends on the people who are going to be bringing a policy through it, and eventually that's going to be us as well. So there's sort of two sides to that youth engagement that I think are really important. And looking to the future, we're not going to be youth forever. But for right now, I think that seeing us just as youth engagers is a tricky way to look at it. I think, as you said, finding ways to make sure that our voices are heard and matter now is going to be important now and into the future. So a good tie back is our conference earlier this last month, I suppose, where we were involved as a youth delegation. Essentially, we were called the Young Disruptors at the NATO COE Directors Conference. And so we were in a really different role than anyone else there, in that everyone else was a Center of Excellence director. So folks who are really smart and experts in their field and have been involved in their fields for years upon years. And so for someone like me coming in at the ground level, that can be quite intimidating. But to see, especially in that context, people really take you on and listen to the ideas you have and really integrate you into the conference can be so important in that experience for me, but definitely moving forward as well.
Absolutely. I can, of course, only agree with that for obvious reasons. But I feel you're touching upon a very, very important part here when it comes to it cuts on both sides, right? So there's something to gain there from the young professional view. Well, I would say even maybe on three sides. There's something to gain from the young professional who is involved with that, who get to go to places and discussions where they normally don't get involved with directly. And what, even though that they might be the junior part on the table and they may not know everything, and probably they don't, but hey, newsflash, probably the senior person at the table also doesn't, but don't tell them that. But what is nice, and I really liked it in Vicenza, but also in other things that I've been involved with professionally, is that if you're the person to ask the questions like, hey, why are you doing it this way? And if you do that well, and then not in a way that it sort of is criticizing, but generally because you don't know how or why things are done a certain way and you want to figure it out, it can often provide with very good insight on, it's like, what, there was a decision that we made, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And back then that made sense to do it this way, but we never stood still and reflected on that whether it still makes sense. So I think that that's a very valid contribution that young people have. And then, of course, as you said, it's interesting career-wise. You get to go to places, you get to network, etc. That's all good. But then the third one is, I think, a sort of movement against what I might call token youth engagement. So we've often seen in the past, I'm not going to call out names or blame anyone because it's simply a process that we're starting to learn and start to do better. And I think the hashtag We're NATO campaign has been the most instrumental vehicle on that. Well, we've more and more seen young professionals being equals on stage, being equals in terms of thought and in terms of the discussions. Starting off with NATO Engages that had young people sitting in on panels publicly, which was like, this is like the big official NATO side event. And suddenly we're seeing young people pop up left and right. Like, hey, that's interesting. There's something going on here. And then that's developed further onto the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Experts, who I'm very proud to also call our patrons. And I'm not going to pretend that we have the same impact as, say, a Greta Thunberg, who at the age of 18 is definitely causing some disruption there. And I suppose that there are more people that are wondering about climate than there are people wondering about NATO. So all is fair there. But would you guys feel that the sort of, if we take this trend of, say, the past 4 years of a new way of youth engagement, is it paying off? Is NATO getting somewhere with this? So Mark, to you first.
So I think before I start to answer that question, I'd like to just congratulate you on correcting Firenze to Vicenza. It's an easy mistake to make, and I'm relieved to see you get it right. Actually, if I might, I really want to kind of like echo something that Hannah pointed out when I talked about kind of mainstreaming.
Go for it.
When I talked about kind of having non-traditional communities who are generally kind of untapped in like the conversation, this also means their skill set and their knowledge is untapped. And we have big communities. So we talk about young people, we talk about gender, and also like I'd like to include like neurodivergent people, and also Hannah talks about kind of race or ethnicity. These are communities that have historically kind of been excluded from like security conversations, and I think it's really, really important to have a security kind of agenda that reflects that. And even from the most kind of closed-minded perspective, there needs to be a recognition that more brains, more experiences, more collective experiences just mean more opportunities to think innovatively, right? And NATO talks all about innovation, and innovation means doing things differently. Now, the military has this kind of culture of deferring things backwards is the expression that's used. And that means, when you're faced with a complicated situation, thinking to how it's always been done and maintaining it. To me, this is the opposite of innovation. And so I'm very keen to kind of introduce a bit of that disruptor mindset to different challenges. And I think there's this culture that if a new thing doesn't work, then the dinosaurs are proved correct. If a new thing doesn't, then the idea is that innovation or coming up with alternative kind of ways of doing things is somehow wrong, which is a very dangerous kind of mindset. I think the methodology of trying new things is very, very important. If they don't work, then that means keep innovating, keep trying until you find something that does work. Yes, and when we talk about young people, when we talk about kind of youth participation, I think there is a risk that we only do so with the mindset that young people are the future of something, the future leaders, the future decision makers. And I recognize that, but I also want to caveat that with young people are also, they're also an important force now in this moment. They're not a qualified voice. It's not that we'll only talk to you because you will matter in 20 years' time. No. Your contribution matters now, particularly when you look at societies where NATO contributes. When we talk about peace building, and this is injecting a bit of the humanitarian kind of mindset or development mindset. When you talk about peace building, what you often need, especially in like ethnically or religiously kind of based conflicts, you need generational change. You need cultural change, which takes a generation. That means investing in young people, having a generation of young people to separate conflict towards a period of peace. This is what you need to have sustainable, long-lasting peace. And this is something that the defense kind of machine has been very to recognize. So I think the sooner kind of like we learn this lesson, the sooner we can have a lot more of an effect. Young people today, and I kind of mean anyone under the age of 30, will really struggle to recall or resonate with like a NATO strategic success, like in their lifetime. And that's something that's very important because credibility, NATO's credibility as an institution comes from people respecting it, people from understanding and trusting it as an institution. And this is very hard. This is a very hard sell to young people, particularly those people who will think of NATO as visually very, very chaotic Afghanistan evacuation as a Taliban resurgence. So I think we need to recognize how NATO looks from a young people's perspective in order to kind of move forward. And I think the NATO, I'm going to use the wrong name, not intentionally, but out of ignorance. There is this NATO Young Advisory, right, which I think the criteria for that is being within the ages of 25 and 35. And John, I say this with no personal weight to you, but there comes a point where relative youth does not mean youth. If you're 30, I'm not sure to what extent you are representing the voices of the entire youth community. There are people at 35 who are NATO experts in their own right without the youth qualifier. And so it gets this point of also, recognizing that in a machinery that has an average age of 55, being 35 is relatively young. But is it absolutely young? Do you represent the voices of young people, this generation who are growing up with this generation's challenges and this generation's exposure to new domains of warfare, cognitive warfare, cyber warfare? Kids who grow up with their entire lives on computers have a very, very important perspective to share and perhaps a range of solutions that someone who is slightly older than them but hasn't had that experience might not have.
No, you're absolutely correct, and I'm not taking offense, even though I'm only 31. Thank you very much. Well, but you're right. If you look at the young leaders group, so the 14 young leaders that were selected to be part of, well, I think the full name is NATO 2030 Young Leaders. Indeed, they are between age 25 and 35, and many of them, and then some of them I've known for quite a while now. It's not that they are sort of special because they're young. If you take Alice, for example, she is a research associate at Chatham House in her full own right. The young part doesn't matter. Ulrich, a gentleman that I've been knowing for a very long time since I was on the board together with him when we were running YATA. He's definitely at the slightly also at the 30 plus side. But the moniker young doesn't contribute to any of these persons. So that I actually agree with you. But then compared to who NATO usually has sort of in the crowd or advising, or if you look at so the Young Leaders group was a counterpart to a NATO expert group. Then they're definitely young. They're very, very young. And that actually is, I think, an issue that NATO has been struggling with quite a bit. And one thing that we have on our website that we use and abuse all the time is a quote from a former SACTI official who is stating that if he could, he would replace 30% of his staff with young people, which already suggests that the current status quo is not having 30% young people. So less than 30% of his staff are below the age of 35. So even if you were to replace everyone with being 35, it would be young. But you strike a very valid point, because by now the generations have been moving forward and forward. Like, I'm a millennial, and after millennials we have Generation Z, and now the current next thing is Generation Alpha. But the oldest people of Generation Alpha are already turning 18 this year. So already 2 generations lacking behind. And you're rightfully put out. Like, if I look at sort of all the new stuff that's out there, and in terms of cyber, digital, and whatnot, like, I'm already old. I can't keep up with this stuff. So let alone that the senior officials who are actually describing policy can fix this. So I absolutely agree with you. If you want to have more insight into it, you're gonna find or try to find the talent between, say, 18 and 25, like people who are currently doing the bachelors and early masters, but have the brilliant ideas. But it is, of course, very tricky to find a person who is and has great thoughts, but is also mature enough and confident enough. I think that's also a very important aspect to say, like, look, I actually have a great idea. I wanna get up on stage and talk about this stuff. Hannah, being our academic in the room, or at least our academic associate, is it something that you also see with the students at Simon Fraser, or the ones that are involved with the field school? Field school is Canada-wide, right? It's not just Vancouver students.
Yes, I was going to say, as the resident 18 to 25 who is still in their academic career, let me swoop in. And I can tell you, to assuage your fears of being 2 generations out, I think the Gen Zs, because I'm right on the cusp. I'm the oldest Gen Z I think you can pretty much get. Yeah, I think we're still in the group that's coming of age, I guess, at this point. I think the alphas are still going through childhood, and we can leave them be for now. But I'm sure they'll be coming up and into this conversation very soon. I think that for us, it can be very intimidating, of course, to get involved in a conversation like this. You are really in this point in career, like the 18 to 25 that you're talking about, you're right on that curve of realizing there's so much that you don't know, and it's to the point that you get quite intimidated. Right, I think you know everything. We're just past that to know there's so much that we don't know, and can get quite intimidating, as I said. But I think that having youth engagement that forces you out of that bubble and forces you into a position that you really need to speak for yourself. For me, that was our conference last month. We were given the moniker of Young Disruptors, and there was a little bit of contention about whether that was the right term for us and what that really meant. But I think that one interesting part of it was that the Stability Policing COE that organized the conference actively avoided the term young professional or youth ambassador. They went with disruptor, and disruptor, to me, it can mean a lot of things, but I think what that told me specifically, and why I got very nervous in coming into the conference, was that I was supposed to have an active role. I'm there to disrupt things, and so that meant that my voice was really important to how the conference was going to go forward. And that was an absolutely terrifying concept to me going into it, because I am absolutely at that point. I don't know anything. I know at least just barely enough to know that I don't know anything. So I think that can be a very nerve-wracking concept to a lot of people in this age group. And definitely something I've seen through my academic engagement. I can give a quick little plug for the NATO Field School, of course. It's not just Vancouver, it's not just Canada, it's actually open to university students across the Alliance. So it's a great program to be involved in if you're interested in this sort of thing. But more to the point, I think we do a lot of surveys of our students coming in and out of the program. And the folks coming into the program are kind of exactly who you would be expecting. It's young folks, usually I think the average age is about 20, who are interested in international relations, interested in political science, but really have been focused on the politics side. So, they have more grandiose ideas of, in the future, I'd like to work at the UN because that's the one they've heard of. They, come into our program usually not knowing a lot about defense, not knowing a lot about how their armed forces works, and really not knowing what NATO does. And so in bringing in, we've talked a lot about bringing new voices that have obviously ignored into these conversations. But what's interesting to me is looking at the students coming into a program like this. These are people that ostensibly should be interested and should be knowledgeable about something like NATO, and yet it's still really not the center of the conversation for us. So that's definitely, I think, a sign of how important youth engagement for an organization like NATO is going to be going forward. And I'm glad that I get to be part of 2 organizations at this point that are really helping them with that job.
All right, that's absolutely fantastic, great stuff. And I wish I was a student again so I could enroll into the field school, but unfortunately I'm not. Right, so we're down to our last 10 minutes and we still haven't figured out yet. So how are we going to fix things? What are we going to do about it? Like very concretely, is there anything that you would say, right, this is something that a young professional, preferably a member of Atlantic Forum, doesn't have to be, could be anyone, can do, well, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this year because we only have 2 months left, but say like your New Year's resolution 2022, this is what I'm going to do to help NATO and help the transatlantic community to be better prepared against discontinuities. Mark, if you go first, and then we'll go with Hannah, and then we'll round up our little podcast.
Well, I suppose, if I could, turn your question into a plea, it would be that NATO helps us to help them. So I think, while I'm a firm believer that, we can provide some solutions, I also, I'm also frustrated with the idea that, excluded communities, should then be left to fix their own exclusion. I think a degree of that responsibility has to come from the big NATO kind of ecosystem itself. I think they need to give us some tools, and one of those tools would be very simply access. I think the COE Directors Forum, Conference, was a fantastic forum, a fantastic platform for us. It was a really good trust building exercise. I think it went very well, and I was really genuinely impressed by how non-token the event was. And I'm absolutely very, very happy to say that if I felt it was token, our contribution was token, I'd be very unhappy about it, and I'd be saying that. I really genuinely felt that there was a degree of respect, a degree of credibility, of trust, and they gave us a protected space within which to operate. They said, this space is yours, and it's ring fenced, it's not going to be shrunk. However, that space focused exclusively on methodology. We were there to disrupt the thinking process, not necessarily the knowledge process. So we were there to disrupt how conclusions were reached, but not to inject new information or youth perspective as such. We didn't change the content. And so I think it was a very, very good kind of first, opening of the door for us. But I really think the next steps have to come with giving young doctors a bit more space to add a youth perspective. And this doesn't have to come overnight. I don't want to scare anyone who might be watching away, but this has to be the thing. There has to be a way for us to share our kind of like experiences, and our perspective with these kind of forums, because there's this phenomenon in kind of like the military where, or any hierarchical organization, um, where they're always a generation behind. If we talk about generation being 25, 30 years, that's how long it takes to reach flag or general rank. So by the time you are senior enough in a position to to shape it, you are shaping it with a culture or a perspective that's outdated. It comes from 25 to 30 years ago, and so I suspect there's always this kind of lag in military kind of cultural awareness or any kind of machinery that's kind of very hierarchical. And this is what I see a lot in NATO. So if there's a way to maybe not shrink that as such, but maybe just catapult a few younger voices to levels that they traditionally wouldn't be kind of heard at, then that would be great. I think we saw at this conference that to be a director of a COE, requires a career's worth of experience. And I think we looked at between, colonel, full colonel, and 1-star. And so if we can find a way to kind of inject maybe more current voices to those challenges, voices that also haven't been shaped by a career full of staff training. I think within NATO, the orders process is very similar, and so the leadership process is very similar. The estimate process is similar. So what you do is you take a lot of very kind of original and very diverse kind of people, and then you mold them through a very one-dimensional kind of thinking and analysis process. And I think there's a lot of value to be taken from exposing people at the top level to that kind of that way of thinking that they maybe had before they were kind of shaped by the same kind of system-wide training.
All right. One thing that I definitely want to stress from this again is that we then also have this well, almost moral obligation, if you will, to do things right. So to just stand on the side and complain that we're not being involved, that's on our own conto. So that's definitely one thing that I'll bring with me as a New Year's resolution for 2022. Now, Hannah, over to you. Your New Year's resolutions. How are you gonna change the world? How are you gonna fix discontinuities in the coming year?
I think, yeah, Mark makes a really good point to make sure that, organizations like NATO leave that door open a crack for us. But like you said, John, the rest of it is on us to, run right through it. And what I've been trying to do in, I guess, both of my roles now is to make sure that as young people, we're helping each other get through those opportunities. I think that a field like this, you can see it as very closed off and it can get very competitive. So making sure that we're working together to find opportunities for young people. And that's sort of going to be my New Year's resolution, I suppose, in my role is trying to find these opportunities, not just for myself, but to try and bring others through that door with me. I think that's going to be really important that we have organizations like the Atlantic Forum where, it's not just I'm a young person and I'm looking for ways to, make my way up that ladder by myself. I think it's way more important that we all work together to try and bring ourselves up to the top as a team. So that's, I think Mark otherwise covered it really well, but that's my New Year's resolution. So I'm glad I already figured that out November 5th. That's all I had to do for the rest of the year, right? And so I'm covered until January. So glad you guys helped me figure that out now.
Well, there's still, making plans is one thing right now about execution. So you still can figure it out for the coming, say, 45 days on how to go about it. And Mark has been stealing the thunder left and right again. Love it. We're nearing the end of our little session, which I think closes in about 3 minutes. Let me check that really quickly. Don't want to leave our audience waiting if we actually have more time. And then we go back to Petra to close this part. So if I can then sort of fill in one more question. If we're talking about very, very practical, is there any idea that, and we're going to assume that we don't have any limitations in terms of manpower or finances or whatsoever. But yeah, something that you would want to do, and spoiler alert, there's a little trick to be made with the with one of our initiatives called the Atlantic Forum Incubator, which is, and it is also a call to action to our listeners of this lovely semi-podcast, that if you have any ideas, pitch them to us, send us an email, contact us via WhatsApp, or what really doesn't really matter how you get a hold of us, and pitch it there, because that's what we're trying to do here as well, right? We're just going to throw 10 juggling balls up in the air, and I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 stick, and the rest doesn't, and that's perfectly fine if they don't stick at the moment. We'll just put them on the shelf, and we'll try again next year. So to fill up our last 7 minutes or so, from both of you, one pitch, ad hoc. Mark, think on your feet. You're good at that. I know that that you can do that. Give me one idea that you want to execute, if no limitation whatsoever.
So, John, thank you for the invitation. As always, I'm full of ideas, right off the cuff. But I've noticed I've been answering the questions first, and in the interest of gender balance, I think it's really important that we give Hannah the opening on this one. So I'm going to take a back seat, and I'm going to let Hannah take this forward.
All right, if that, I really like it. WPS and whatnot.
Oh my God, the first one that I finally went, thank goodness Mark is going first on this, so that I have some time to think. All the rest I'm going, oh no, Mark is going first. He's going to take all of my ideas. I don't know. I think, the concrete pitch is a tough one. And I think that, we were watching recently the COP26 speeches and everything, and we can see, even from the top levels, coming up with the policies and ideas on how to move forward with our big ideas can be really tough. I can tell you that for me personally, the concrete things that I want to be working on over the next while, and if anyone in the audience is listening and gets interested, we're working on the Atlantic Forum, the Academy. We're going to be working on our COE engagement initiative, which I'm really excited to push forward even further. And I think that, as we've shown, our most concrete example for the three of us on how we want to move youth engagement forward comes from our experiences last month at that one conference. And I think we've all been involved in a lot of youth engagement over the years. And so the fact that we all kind of have one thing that we're pointing to on, this is what we want to build on going forward, how do we want to make it even better? That's just really singing the praises of it to me even further. That shows how great trying to bring in a new idea like this. So I think that's going to be as concrete as I'm able to get on the spot here. So I'll throw it back over to Mark. Thanks so much for that.
So thank you very much, Hannah. Not stealing my idea as well. I'm going to buy myself a tiny bit more time by
Mark, if I may
sharing with
intercede, I recall a very interesting discussion we had about another organization called the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. And I think you had some ideas about that, how we could do more youth engagement with, well, not per se that organization, but young parliaments in general, parliamentarians, I should say.
So for the first 10 seconds of that remark, I really thought you were stitching me up. I was trying to
Oh, come on, Mark. Is that how you think of me? Oh.
I'm just going to explain this continuity error to our 48,000 live viewers on YouTube currently, and about half that again on Facebook. When I saw the signal come up that said we still had 8 minutes left, I panicked because I was losing battery at the rate of about 1% a minute. And I did the maths and it wasn't going to last. So I just turned my camera off to plug in. I had to unplug the light to plug in my charger. So if any eagle-eyed viewers noticed the there's your answer. And your prize is my answer, I suppose. Yes. So going back to my point about democracy, young people are a fundamental component to the democratic process, democratic participation, democratic engagement, both now in their current form as the biggest stakeholder who don't have, structural influence in how policy is made, and also future leaders. With that in mind, I am an election observer with OSCE. And this is a very dinosaur-riddled field. A lot of people who I do election observation with would be offended by that, but they also don't know how to work YouTube, so they won't be watching this. It's one of those fields where a certain degree of experience is required, a certain professional profile, which makes it quite inaccessible to young people, but actually is quite intuitive. The qualification for being an election observer, in my mind, is having done election observation. And because of this vicious cycle, it's quite exclusive, whereas the reality is anyone can be put through the process. And once you've done one mission, you've done 100. And so I'm very keen to move forward the idea of young people participating in the election observation process through the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Most big parliamentary assemblies, so the European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and NATO and OSCE, send parliamentarians as recipients of the democratic process, people who have received the democratic vote and who know how election campaigns can and should be run, to go and observe democratic processes. They're not the experts, but they are very well-informed and useful contributors. And so I think the next step for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is to reach out to young people, or the next step for the Atlantic Forum is to offer our availability to the Parliamentary Assembly, to say we have young people who have a voice, who have a stake, who are as qualified as you are. I don't want to name any individual kind of politicians, but I think we've seen this year that a lot of very, very high profile leaders are not necessarily that experienced or competent or qualified for their role. And so I don't think the argument that is typically used to suppress kind of young people's voice, that we're not qualified or experienced, has any credibility in this case. I think it would be very good for NATO as a trust building exercise to show that we are taking young people seriously and we are listening to young people. If we look at the biggest threats to democracy, the cognitive domain and the cyber domain at the moment, we look at disinformation. These are emerging kind of threats that have both exploited young people, in the sense that young people have been used to generate these threats because they are very technologically kind of aware. Also been the recipients, in that they are also the bigger consumers of these kind of online platforms. So I think there's a very, very strong case for young people to be part of the democratic kind of observation process, and I think that's a very, very kind of exciting way forward. The other thing that I would say would be that young people should continue to collaborate with the Centers of Excellence, even though they are NATO accredited as opposed to part of the NATO core structure. They are at the forefront of innovation. They are at the forefront of developing doctrine, identifying emerging threats, and finding solutions. And that's where young people come in. We are the innovators and the disruptors of NATO, and I think it's very important that we are given that opportunity, to create that opportunity by making ourselves available to continue pushing with the Centers of Excellence.
All right, so I think we've got two most excellent ideas. I also have a very angry, well, I'm not sure if she's angry, but Petra, who wants to close down our session. No, kidding. No, so this was absolutely fantastic. I'm looking very forward to. Oh, she now texts that I'm being mean. I'm not being mean at all, Petra. I love you. You know that. Hannah, Mark, thank you very much for this wonderful contribution. I'm looking very forward to work with both of you in the coming year to see if we can develop these ideas further. Again, call to action. Anyone else who has any brilliant ideas or has been inspired by this session, please do reach out to us. We're going to stop here. Petra, over to you. Thank you very much again to you and your team for organizing all of this. It has been absolutely fantastic this evening, and I'm looking very forward to the rest of the weekend. Cheers.